you can do it and you can put out a lot of power. You just don't realize that you're a little tired all the time.
And those people, they're not tapering. They're going to end up pretty fatigued when they show up to compete.
Anytime you try to cram fitness, it's usually not good.
Movement economy is king in the sport.
You're not going to build strength in one session. You're not going to build endurance in one session.
So you're trying to get practice on all of those in a 3-day period, but you also don't want to beat yourself up before the competition, but you want to make sure that you're touching all those movements.
All right, boys, we're
Hi,
live.
You're leading, Chris.
Look what we did.
Recording this September 10th.
Yeah.
we'll keep
Tomorrow's
it going.
September 11th.
Yeah. Nicole made fun of us for all having the same seating posture, but
Y'all do. What
Yeah.
are y'all doing?
well, when we first got in these seats, you were like, "Hey, it's awkward if you sit like normal." So I've been trying to get cross-legged.
Well, I just didn't want your balls showing.
Yeah.
But I mean, you can do whatever you want.
We need a cue from Chris at some point where all of us do the switch to the other side.
Oh, man.
So like I was saying, where were y'all on 9/11?
I was in New York.
You were in New York.
Yeah, that's where I grew up. Yeah, we had people.
What grade were you in?
Were you a freshman? Because I was a sophomore.
Yeah, freshman in high school. Yeah, we had people like in our school whose parents passed away and stuff. Like it was crazy.
man.
Yeah, and like we didn't know, like all the communication was not as good, and like we didn't know where our parents were. It was pretty crazy, sketchy.
Yeah.
Yeah, you didn't have a cell phone at that time, did you?
I don't think so.
I definitely
yeah.
did not.
Yeah, I did.
If I did, it was like a flip phone one, and like the communication. My dad's Middle Eastern too, so they like came and interviewed into my house and stuff like that. But I feel like the communication all got like wacky. It was like the school like shut down, went into emergency mode. There were no classes. We couldn't get in touch with people. Some people were like, "Oh my God, my parents work down there on Wall Street." Like it was a pretty sketchy time.
I remember I was in AP biology and we were on like a break. We had like a bathroom break or a drink break or something. And I was in the hallway and one of my friends that was on the swim team came running down the hallway and he goes, "Go back to your classroom and turn on the TV." I was like, okay. I was like, I asked my teacher, Mr. Wilhelm, I was like, "Hey, can I go back and turn on the TV?" He's like, "Sure." I turned it on and literally as I turned it on, the second plane, like I turned it on and
Live.
that moment, yes, live, the second plane crashed into it. And I remember turning to one of my friends that was in the class and I said, "What movie is this?" Right? Because there was no way that this was
Yeah.
a real thing that was happening. I
Yeah.
was like, "What movie is on?" And he's like, "I don't think this is a movie." And then I remember the rest of the day being so weird.
Yeah, it was just crazy.
I think I'd just gotten my driver's license. And I remember afterward, I needed to get gas and the lines to get gas at that point were like, and I was in a small town.
Yeah, people are panicked.
Dude, it was like hundreds of cars backed up.
What
And,
time of day was that?
I mean, I don't remember what time we got out.
I think
So
it
probably
was-
like 2:45.
Because I had the opposite thing but it was later at night. I remember at like 7, me, my mom, and my sister watched all day on TV at home. My dad was actually in New York. He was a pilot. So he was like near it. But eventually we got hungry and we were like, we got nothing here. We went to Taco Bell. I remember driving through our little town trying to go to Taco Bell and it was just empty.
Ghost town.
And it was like the first time I'd seen my town empty. I was like, this is weird. Is anyone even going to be at Taco Bell?
That was a crazy.
But we got
crazy
our cinnamon
experience.
twirls. Don't you worry.
I thought we were talking about peaking. And
Yeah, we are
tapering.
talking about peaking. Brandon, you got any cool story before we
Yeah, I mean,
we
I
don't want to
think-
leave you out.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think my story is kind of similar to Kyle's. I was in class and the teacher next door, you know how some of the doors like kind of you can bypass to another classroom. She ran in and whispered to our teacher and then the teacher just went to the TV and turned it on because we had a TV in the classroom. It was social studies.
How old were you?
I was in middle school.
I was going to say you were.
Yeah. So these guys are older.
Yeah, we were all in high school, yeah?
Yeah.
Everybody here?
Yeah. Just this young buck.
it is wild though that, you know, those kind of like those seminal moments that you have in your life, you can like it's vivid in my memory of who was sitting in front of me. I know the kid.
Yeah.
I know who was sitting behind me. I remember the teacher coming in. It's like that adrenaline rush that happens that then just like tattoos it on your memory.
I can't remember that much the moment I found out. I remember, and maybe because I played it, it was played on the TV over and over again. I remember when I got back home, sitting down and watching the news and seeing like repeats of the planes hitting the towers, the Pentagon one, like just like over and over. And it's like burned in my memory, I feel like.
Yeah, I think I was in. I remember that day pretty vividly. To Brandon's point, and I remember being in math class a couple hours later, and they're like, another plane hit the Pentagon. I mean, I could go back and tell you who the friend was. I don't want to, put them on blast on the podcast, but I remember who was it told me running down the hallway, who it was I turned to and was like,
why would that put him on blast?
I was saying that too, and I was like, he's probably not watching the podcast.
Did he hijack the plane? Who are you protecting?
It's not my place.
The guy who told me, so I was walking between classes, and the guy who told me was like a big Juggalo ICP fan, kind of weird dude. One of my homeboys, but he came up, run up to me, and he's just like, they hit the towers, man, or whatever he said. And I was just like, all right, Carlos, like this is typical Carlos stuff. Like, and then walked into the room and they had it on the TV. I was like, oh God.
Oh, they hit the towers, man.
Yeah. All right. So peaking and tapering.
Yeah. That was 24 years ago, 23 years ago.
23 years ago.
Yeah. God, we are getting old.
Yes.
You look it too.
Do you think? Sorry,
Thanks, Brandon.
Before we get to peaking and tapering or whatever we're talking about, do you think that you will have that same memory for COVID? But COVID was like a slow drip,
was
so
like
there
a
wasn't
slow
like
burn.
the.
Yeah, it wasn't
but for
like a
me,
moment.
I know I have a moment because I had COVID when I was sick with COVID, which I later found out, and I was watching the NBA game, that the OKC game, where they canceled it in the middle of the game. So there I am with a fever watching a basketball game, and half the arena just stand up and exits. And I'm like, oh my God, they're canceling a live basketball game for this?
Everyone's already there.
Like, I'm going to die. Like this thing that I thought was just whatever is now legit.
I was at that, the competition in Canada. I don't remember which one it was, but we had gotten up there and I remember we landed and I was with Cedric and his girlfriend, and Haley was with me, and we like got to their house and they're like, hey, on the news, like Justin Trudeau, who is the prime minister, I don't know if he still is.
He still is, yeah.
Yeah. His wife had just like as we landed tested positive for COVID. But prior to that, hadn't even heard what COVID was. But then next day we drove up there and they called us all into the building, right? Into the venue and got everyone together. And then they're like, yeah, we have to cancel the event.
I'll never forget. I got there and I was like, this is the dumbest thing. Hold on. If this is some deadly disease,
get close.
Why are we all in the same room?
But I did it anyway. I showed up to here.
We left that, and both Haley and I were like, we have to get home now. Yeah. Because it was weird. Like the day before, everyone was still out. And then the next day we were in the middle of, I think it was Montreal. I don't even remember where exactly we were at that point. I was just getting chauffeured around. But it was like a ghost town. For Montreal to be a ghost town, it was pretty crazy.
Yeah, I was scared that I wasn't going to get home. I wasn't scared that I was going to get...
Were you in Canada with us?
Yeah.
Man, there was
another week and you would have been stuck there.
Yeah. They like locked down travel and stuff.
My mother-in-law was on that cruise ship that got quarantined.
No
it was
way.
one of the first like true spreads, if you guys remember that.
Yeah,
she was stuck there for 4 or 5 weeks on the ship.
That sounds like a nightmare.
So Jordan was on NBC, the Atlanta NBC station, doing an interview because her mom was over there.
No way.
I'll have to pull that up for you guys after.
You never told us that.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sure. Ask Jordan for the story. It's
all
funny.
right. So peaking.
What a nice segue.
Hopefully that was interesting to people.
They fast forward.
All right. So y'all wanted to talk about peaking for a off-season competition, and I just wanted to set the stage here. What is peaking quickly? Like, what's your quick version of what peaking is?
I get to go? All right. So
should we all answer this?
No, just let's make it quick.
Yeah. So peaking is adjusting your training in a way to make it so that you can perform at your best when it matters, which should be your off-season competition or your primary competition. So just making some adjustments to volume and intensity, the style of training to peak or to make it your best effort and best event when it matters.
And so we're making the differentiation here that it's off season, which kind of implies that when it's in season, we kind of know our goalpost. We know it's like the open, quarterfinals, semifinals, and the games, depending on what level athlete you might be. With the off season, you have competitions all over the place. So we're kind of implying that, you might be on a plan, but you might have to deviate it randomly to peak for the random competition that you just decided to sign up for.
Well, I think part of with peaking and tapering is it's not random. And I think that's the key, is that you need to have
the competition you might sign up for is random, is what I was saying.
But if you want to peak for it, if you want to peak even in the off season, you're going to have a plan. You need to know what you're going to compete in. It shouldn't be something that you're signing up for and being like, oh, next week I'm going to compete in this thing. That is not conducive to a good peak. I guess is the way I would put it.
That's good to know.
Yeah, I mean, it's different if you're trying to just maintain your fitness. You can be in a state where you haven't done, let's say you're taking classes and you've just been training regularly in the class, hasn't done muscle ups, but you're trying to enter into a competition that is going to have a workout with muscle ups in it, you probably need to do extra preparation to get yourself ready for that specific test of fitness. Otherwise, you're probably going to get smashed by it. Like if you haven't done muscle ups for a month, you jump into a test that has a bunch of muscle ups like the standard, you're probably not going to do well. So the peak is really the sport performance side of things. It's like actually preparing yourself to show up and have practiced some of the things that you're going to do under competitive pressure.
All right. So the key there I just got from Kyle is that you got to be well in advance of these things if you're going to actually be at your best.
Yeah. To Max's point, like if you do know, for example, that muscle ups are going to show up, then you need to be training your muscle ups for weeks in advance. Right.
Well, I think that's dust stuff, so we could skip on past that. I don't need to hear
you practice things.
Yeah, I don't need to hear you ramble about that for a little bit. But what are some of the common mistakes people make? Let's say they've already checked the box, Kyle, of, they've picked their competition well in advance, and now they're following whatever program, maybe it's ours, someone else's, but they don't have an individual coach, let's say in this example. How do they know how to peak for that competition based on what they're doing?
Well, let's talk about what the basics of a peak are. So it's going to be a reduction in your training volume, right? So that fatigue is going to dissipate. When you're training all the time, let's say you're going to classes or you're following compete, you're building up this just kind of chronic fatigue level. It's accumulating over the course of, the entire time that you're training. And with a peak, what you're trying to do is reduce some of that fatigue, but you're going to want to increase the intensity of your training. And intensity in this case is going to be like making sure that your training weights are similar to what the competition weights are going to be, that your intensity or actual like how you're approaching the workouts is similar to how you're going to approach the workouts in competition. Because in reality, most people, when they're training, they're training at a level that feels more sustainable. And when you're competing, you kind of get pulled out of that comfort zone. So the two big things are, over the course of like a week or 2 weeks leading into the competition, you want to reduce the volume of your training, and you want to slightly increase the intensity of your training going into that peak.
I would pull it back a little bit. Let's talk about someone, because there are some competitions that are coming up. A lot of people are, the Legends workouts, for example, by the time that this is released, will be out. So for masters that are doing that qualifier, it's happening in September. You don't have a ton of time to peak. It's already here. But let's say someone's planning on doing a qualifier that's in November. So you have 8 or 9 weeks. That's kind of when you want to start that process of thinking about, how do I prepare for the competition? So instead of, maybe if we pulled back a little bit, instead of just talking about the last 2 weeks of what we would consider like a true taper or peak, what would you guys do for someone that is preparing for a qualifier, a Wadapalooza or something big that's coming up in a little bit longer time frame? How would you start that?
Let's actually think of an example of one. What's coming up in the December, November area?
Well, I think those would be the live events. So something like,
are we talking about peaking for a live event or peaking for a qualifier right now?
Those are two
because a lot of
different
people won't peak for a qualifier if they're getting ready to go to a competition.
Yeah, I think those are two very different things.
You want to explain why?
Well, yeah. Well, first I wanted to start with why we wanted to talk about peaking and tapering, because there's a lot of people that organize and orient in the sport of fitness. They orient their whole season around CrossFit and the events of the games this year, and also just the proliferation of competitions in the event have made it so that a lot of people now who are very competitive in CrossFit don't just look at the CrossFit Games as their season. Maybe they go to TFX, Fittest of the Coast. They like the in-person competitions more, and building a plan that allows people to optimally peak for those is like required. And it's a little bit different if you're in an off season that's preparing for the game season and you need to get optimally ready for that competition. So I think the first thing that people need to do if they really want to be prepared for something is kind of zoom out and make a plan. Like we started a data project and realized how big it was of finding all of the competitions that are out there that have qualifiers, different divisions, so that we could help people build their season structure to know, like, okay, I'm going to this competition in November and this one into January, and this is when I need to be ready. And I think that process where you're kind of zoomed out a little bit needs to happen before you plan a peak or a taper, because you need, like, I would say 8 weeks, maybe 12 weeks to like get 12 weeks would probably be more optimal, but I'd say like 6 to 8 weeks would probably be like a minimum for an athlete to have time to build up their volume, back it off, and like taper and be ready for that moment. Would you guys agree with that?
That was basically what I was getting at the beginning of this conversation, is that, this isn't something, it's not going to be a random competition that you're going into or something like that. If you want to take advantage of a peak, it has to be a planned process, something that does go back, like to Brandon's point, 8 weeks prior, 10 weeks prior, 12 weeks prior, where you are starting to build volume over that period of time, right? And a program like Compete does that very well. It keeps the volume very well, controlled, and it raises and lowers throughout the season. But that process of starting your plan, starting your planned peak 12 weeks before, but the actual peak doesn't really occur until about 2 weeks out from the competition.
Yeah, and you don't have to peak for every competition you go to. You can just have a training cycle and be like, okay, on week 6, I'm jumping into this High Rocks event and I'm going to do it relatively untrained. But then your expectation needs to be that like your peak performance for you on that day doesn't really matter because you're delaying gratification to some other big event that you're doing, or you're not a serious competitor that has serious performance goals in a competition.
You're just
setting.
going for the fun of the
experience.
Yeah,
you're just doing it for fun, which is fine. Like, that's how I consider if I jump into a class or jump into a partner workout on a Saturday, like I'm still going there to like compete and get the best out of myself, but I know I'm not like prepared for it and like in peak performance for that type of a thing.
This concept also really only applies to people who treat their CrossFit or whatever as an athlete where there's a season to it, right? Because if what you're doing is just going to classes and trying to stay fit, then the concept of, building your training volume and having peaks and tapers doesn't really apply that much to you. You're just trying to maintain the highest level of fitness that you can at all times. And so just go compete and enjoy competing.
But I think this might be sobering to people because I would be willing to bet that if I asked you guys that y'all get questions all the time for people who just do randomly pick a competition and say, all right, how do I get my best right beforehand? And so it's probably sobering, like, oh, we don't have an answer for you, right?
Yeah, there isn't a way to really do that. If what you're doing is just trying to maintain the highest level of fitness that you possibly can all the time, I think people that treat themselves like an athlete, they have periods of time where they are more fit and less fit, and they've accepted that there's going to be an off season where they are less fit, but also periods of time where, their training volume is really, really high and they're at the peak of their fitness, and there's going to be times where they're tapering to make it where it really counts in competition. And as a coach and an athlete who's been through both of those cycles, where I just tried to maintain really high levels of fitness and then also gone through peaking and tapering cycles, your performance on game day is way better taking the athlete approach versus the just maintain the highest level of fitness all the time.
Yeah, I tell athletes and Compete especially because you're following a program that's year round, right? And there's no specific time in there that's like we're peaking for this except for the CrossFit season. And that may change with how the sport evolves over the next year. We'll see what happens. But we do have options for peaking when an athlete wants to. So people will come in and they want to do a couple competitions. They say, well, how should I structure my season? And what I tell them is have 1 or 2 competitions that you are, Max, to your point, just doing for fun. I call those benchmark competitions. And usually I tell people pick a 1-day or a 2-day competition. Is not going to beat you up. Don't worry about peaking for it because they're just trying to have fun and get a benchmark of where am I at in the season. So that may be your local competition at the gym you go to that has 4 workouts on a Saturday. You just get a feel for where you're at. But then also pick at least 1 competition in the off season. Do the full qualifier, and then if you qualify, go to the in-person and actually do a full 8-week or 10-week peak and taper phase where you're building up for it and then you're tapering off, to your point, Kyle, about actually how you would reduce volume, increase intensity. Then you get the best of both worlds where this is just a little going off the script here. I was talking to a buddy today who said, I'm doing a half marathon. I was like, oh, when is it? It's like 3 weeks from now. Just randomly decided to do it.
Yes. This is how most people probably operate.
Right. Exactly. But
has he run? Like
he runs. Runner? Yeah. Okay. So he's a firefighter. They do a lot of physical fitness.
It'd be the equivalent of somebody who's like, I do classes or I have a program, right, and they're going to jump into a comp.
And I obviously made fun of him. I was like, that's kind of a silly idea, but he wants to do it for fun. So it doesn't really matter. It's just a benchmark for him. If he loves this though, he said he's going to get into it because he wants to find something that he has some goals toward. And that's when you would start planning an off-season structure where you'd peak for a big competition. So I encourage people to do both, but don't be as reckless to think that you can just go into a competition, like follow a normal program and then jump in on a Friday and do all the qualifiers and be able to qualify, because that's going to be really hard.
Yeah, and Max already touched on this a little bit, but have appropriate expectations. So if you're going to take the I'm just going to have fun approach and not peak, then make sure that your expectations are that your performance in that competition or in that fun event are going to be in line with how you prepared for it.
Do you have any advice for that crowd? So if, like Brandon, you just said you suggest people do both a fun one and a legit one where they're actually caring. Do you have advice for people on how to approach these fun things in the way that they're going to get the most out of it? Does that make sense?
I would say I don't, because I've generally not done a good job of approaching things.
But you've coached plenty of people who have. So if you ain't got no advice, get off this show.
I tend to coach more people that,
Max,
that take it more seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, most of it is mindset and cultivation, or like a focus on the basic stuff that people do. Like, people don't realize doing a high rocks or doing a 3-day CrossFit competition or a jiu-jitsu competition or whatever, like physical exertion thing is very hard on your body. And a lot of people's lifestyles are not lived like athletes, but they're asking their bodies to do athlete things. So they show up to these competitions where it's 3 days of 4 workouts on each day, and they're not dialed in with hydration, food. They're anxious, so they're not sleeping. They have no strategy for the workout. So I always encourage people, when they go for fun and you haven't prepared physically, because the physical preparation takes a long time. Like, you can't like just all of a sudden get your body to back squat, double your body weight. Like, you got to be on progressive squat cycles and be dialed in with that pattern. But the mental side of it, you can approach. And I always think that the best thing people can do leading into those things is just make sure that you focus on the details that help your body recover best from the competition. And I know that's like a duh thing. Maybe I should skip over it, but be surprised, even high level athletes that get into the moment of competition. Like, I stayed with Julian and coached him, and part of that job was almost like acting as a babysitter and being like, hey, we're going to the grocery store. What's your food list? And like literally just reminding him of things like, hey, you need this, you need this.
Stop breakdancing.
Yeah. He did wait until the end of the competition for that. But I think for non-athlete minded people that are just jumping into a competition, that is like the biggest bang for your buck, the mental side of it, having good strategies, having game plans for your hydration, your food, your sleep, and I know it's not sexy, but that can help you get more peaked quicker than trying to cram training. Because if you cram training, you show up tired and beat up.
I think that the biggest key is still mind state when it's a for fun competition, especially if you are a competitor. Like, I say that I don't want to compete, but if we're going out there and doing a workout, I'm still trying to beat you guys. Yeah. You know, like all of us.
We know.
Yeah, right. We know. But I think that what the best do is that they're realist when it comes to where they're at in their season and how they should perform. And they're able to, even though they're frustrated maybe with their performance, if they don't do something well, they learn from it, as opposed to being like, oh, you know, everything's going to hell in the handbasket kind of thing. So I encourage people, when it is for fun, it truly is just a benchmark. This is just, I want to see where I'm at. Just like if I was doing a tester, a throwdown workout on a Saturday and TDD compete, I just want to see where I'm at, and then you move on from there. But that's also why it's important to, at least one time in the off season, pick a competition where you take it seriously, because we always talk about practicing the skill of competing. There's no better way to practice than the actual scrimmage of a full live competition in person, where you have a judge and your people you're going against.
I think also it's good for people that, if you're recreational and you're not sure, like, I'm definitely competitive, but I don't know if I want to take it seriously, or I don't know if I want that pressure. The pressure and the seriousness drives performance. Like, that's why we're talking about peaking. But also, a lot of people don't enjoy it. The anxiousness, the disappointment if you try to peak and you don't execute well, or you got nervous, or you got a bad judge, or whatever. So I think it can be very good for people to decide. Like, some people get into it and they're like, this life is for me and I want to do another one. And other people, it's like, oh, I don't want to take it this seriously. I'd much rather compete for fun. And that self-awareness can make the whole journey just more fun, one way or another. So I encourage people that even aren't uber competitive to try it out one time and just go through a peaking cycle, prepare for something specifically, put in a little bit of extra work, have some performance expectations, see what you get out of yourself, and see if that is something that sets your soul on fire.
To that point, one of the other advantages would be competing on a team, because that does take some of that competitive pressure off of you. As long as the team has the same the same mindset, and everybody's, on the same page about what you guys are trying to achieve. But I've been on a team that was like that before. When we went to the games, that team, we all had the same expectations.
It's very rare though.
We had a lot of fun, and I'll tell you, having competed at the games as an individual in the Masters and there, it was a lot less stressful competing on the team, and it was a lot more fun competing on the team than as an individual. But I just personally like the stress of competing as an individual.
I like competing on a team if I'm not the weakest link on a team, and in a CrossFit setting, I might be.
I've been there on a team with Brandon. I was the weakest link in every event but one. Yeah. It wasn't great.
Yeah.
Well, back to the competitive person who is taking their peak serious or whatever. Dang, I just lost my train of thought.
While you're thinking about it, one last
ahead.
thing that's, I think, a huge benefit for picking some competitions to do is it actually makes the training more fun for most people when you're doing, because you have this goal. In 8 weeks, I'm preparing for this qualifier, or in 8 weeks, I'm going to this in-person competition, and it keeps you more engaged, which I think allows you to see better progress, again, for most people when you're doing a competition that way.
Okay, I remember.
Go ahead.
So y'all been doing this for like 10, 15 years now. How has coaching a peak changed? I imagine that it's not the same as how you used to do it. Like, and what are those things, and how's it evolved over the years? Like, what have you learned to discard, and what have you added?
I think for me, this is always true when you're writing a group program and down to coaching an individual. But working with more individuals, I've realized that, especially in a CrossFit setting, the peak is very different for different types of athletes. And some people in like the sport of CrossFit, which I think is maybe similar to something like fighting or martial arts, is some people almost need to keep their training volume a little bit higher leading into competition than if you're peaking for something that's like a race, like a 2K row or something, just because there's so much volume within it. So I think that's one little deviation that I found over time is it's individualized, and some of that individualization is like how much you want to keep them beat up leading in. And with those athletes, like Travis is somebody that we've, had our disagreements over the years, and he wants to be trained aggressively into competition. So instead of pulling all his volume down, I'll pull the volume of things that will beat his joints up leading into competition. So instead of doing heavy squat cleans for 10 minutes in an AMRAP, he'll still do a 10-minute AMRAP, but the movement selection will be like row, burpee, and air squat. So he's still going at max effort, but it's not a total training load that he would be handling 4 weeks out. So I think
he couldn't recover from.
Yeah. So it's just the game is maybe a little bit different, but the principles are always the same, which is kind of what Kyle laid out earlier.
Yeah, to Max's point as well, I think one of the mistakes that I made early on is that I did reduce volume too much, to the point that when someone would go to compete, they would get incredibly sore doing 150 wall ball, where in training normally they wouldn't get that sore from doing the same stimulus. So I would say from 10 or 12 years ago to now, that's one of the things that I've done is really maybe err on the side of keeping the volume. They might not do 200 wall ball leading into a competition, which would be their like normal training volume, but I would keep it close to the competition volume up until 3 or 4 days out. So it's a reduction in volume. And to Max's point, it's a reduction in like joint stress and contraction volume, but the total amount of training is going to stay relatively static, but the intensity is going to have to go up.
Yeah. And I think I added more, if I taper somebody aggressively, let's say that taper starts 7 to 14 days out, depending on the person, where the volume starts to come down. The goal is that their mood and their body and their strength starts to rise right at the right time. But then maybe the day before, 2 days before competition, I'll have them do a max effort workout that's 2 minutes long. So that
stinger.
Yeah, it's called a stinger. Who came up with the name?
That was
stinger?
Something that we used to do in swimming.
Was it called a stinger?
We called it a stinger.
Oh, okay.
Basically,
so you brought the name.
Yeah, the day before competition, if you were like say I was a 50 freestyler, we would do like a max effort 37.5 from the blocks, like something to just kind of wake your nervous system up, something to get you. I always looked at it as like you need to touch speed again. And I think in CrossFit, what happened to me is I went to, it's a long time ago, but went to 2014 Wadapalooza. You were coaching me there. And in the first event, I just wasn't ready for the speed that everyone was moving, even though I felt like normally I would have no problem with that. And we talked about it right afterward. I was like, I need a stinger from now on. Like right the day before, I need to do something that's like 15, 12, 9, echo burpee or something like that. That hurts really bad, but doesn't really leave you, to your point, with like a lot of joint soreness or things like that. That's where that whole concept came from. So all the way back, it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, you don't want the shock. That's what I maybe realized is we would taper people and they'd be like strong and ready to go on game day, but the shock of the full speed of event one, it's like their body hadn't touched that for a little too long. So I think those are kind of the like different things.
I think now we should say, though, we've been saying peaking and tapering. And so I think the big question there is like, okay, we get that you're trying to peak for the event and we want to be our best, but why is it that we have to do this tapering part where we're bringing it down? Like can you talk us through what tapering is?
Yeah, I mean, he kind of alluded to it earlier with the accumulation of fatigue over time. When you lower volume or you taper volume, you're essentially also lowering fatigue so that people can express. You don't realize, or some people don't realize, they get into a rhythm and they're doing morning cyclical work and a strength program and then a Metcon, and they're doing 3 sessions a day, 5 days a week. You can do it and you can put out a lot of power. You just don't realize that you're a little tired all the time. So when you remove that tiredness a little bit, you allow people to express the extra 5%, which in a competitive setting, like on a leaderboard,
it's huge.
Yeah. That's the dictation of like 5th and 20th on a leaderboard is really only like 10 seconds on this workout, 5 pounds on this workout. It's just those little details.
I always liken it to like your potential is like a cup of water, right? And if you want it to be where the edge of the water is over the edge of the cup, where it's kind of like floating there, that's where we want to get you. But most of your training is where that water is probably 75% full. You're still pretty good. You could drink that water if you wanted to, but the potential is not quite to the peak of where you need to be. So a taper should allow you to fill that cup all the way back up to where you're almost spilling over and you're really ready to go. You feel really good. And that, to Max's point earlier, is going to be different for every kind of athlete. Travis wanted to still go pretty hard where he was maybe at 90% and then he kind of filled the cup the rest of the way. Some people need a more aggressive taper. I think the difference with CrossFit, though, is that you still have to stay really refined on the skills all the way up to competition. Whereas if it is just you're doing a 1 mile run or a 2K row, you can really lower and just have a lot of intensity leading up to it because it's only one event and you're doing it one time.
Yeah. So, I mean, in that format, instead of doing the standard, for example, in training in a taper, you might do A is 3 power clean and jerks on the minute for 10 minutes. So you still get 30 reps, but they're easier and spread out. And then you do a 5-minute EMOM of 6 muscle ups, which for some people would be a lot, but let's just say an elite person where that's not hard, and then do some snatches afterwards. They still accumulate all of the reps of the movements, but you didn't really like bring it in an intense, I'm going to get beat up format. Now,
another option to bring intensity up using the same example standard might be that you do 15 clean and jerk, 15 ring muscle up, 15 power snatch, but use the same rep cadence that you would in the same braking structure on the rings that you would in the actual competition event, so that the intensity mirrors game day, but the volume's a little bit lower. Yeah. I think those are kind of the two, when Max is saying like Travis wants to keep his volume a little bit higher, and then I'm saying that, I want to keep the intensity a little higher, the volume a little lower. I think those are the kind of two ends of that spectrum.
And any process of getting yourself good at something is individualized. Like in every sport, there's people that skin the cat in so many different ways. But in order to do it, I feel like you need some sort of intention, you need some sort of process, and then you need to be able to like post-event review. Like, oh, this really worked for me. Or, oh, I dropped my volume a lot and I felt flat on game day. So the next time I go into it, I'll make a change. And over time, as you approach competitions more mindfully, you develop your own process that you enjoy, that feels good, that gets your performance, and you understand how to peak your own system. But I don't think you can do that without having a purposeful structure leading into it.
Well, and to that point as well, one of the things that I talked to Adam about after the Masters games was that I think for the most part, our peak was pretty dialed in, but I I got those quad cramps in the run. And when my running volume is higher and my running frequency is at least 3 days a week, I don't get the cramps the way that I do, but we dropped the volume down pretty significantly, and we dropped the frequency down to 2 days per week. And even by the last run that I did before we left, I was already starting to notice some VMO fatigue. So one of the things we're going to do in the future is keep running frequency and volume higher leading into competition while we taper the remainder. So it might even be something where, the longer you do this, you start to really refine, all right, my running volume and frequency needs to stay higher, but my barbell cycling frequency and volume needs to come down. I need to get a couple of touches at like 85% on my max lifts. And, those are going to maintain those. So it's like really starting to understand how to adjust each of the variables within.
And that's why it's important to practice that by doing competitions in the off season, especially if you have like a big goal. Maybe it is for someone, Wadapalooza is that big goal. We'll do a competition before that where you're practicing it. And maybe it's, again, a small one that you do, but you can learn those things and then adjust it for the next peak, to your point, Max.
Yeah.
Do you feel like this crowd is like kind of hard to get the buy-in on the tapering part?
Who's this crowd?
Like the CrossFit crowd, like, because everyone wants to. Am I making an assumption that's wrong here, that everyone likes to work hard and that you tell them to stop working hard? That
do you remember a couple of years ago, Froning said that he had never tapered, and this was probably 21 or 22. He was at the games with the team, and he was like, "Man, this is the first time I've ever tapered, and I feel great." But he literally was implying that he'd never run a taper prior to that game. So I think there's this sentiment in the sport that, to Chris's point, that people try to avoid tapering. That like, I just want to train hard all the way up until it. But I mean,
well, then talk me out of it.
Well, I have two things on that.
Yeah.
The first is, I think it's generally a bad idea in any realm, not just CrossFit, but in any realm, to assume that the best practice is always from the best, because it's very hard to replicate.
Probably never, right?
Yeah, like there's so many variables that allow somebody to be able to train at that intensity and never get hurt and show up and be so confident that they can win. And most people, that's not the deck that they were dealt. So it's like, all right, fine, like you don't have that genetic disposition. You can try to do that, but it'll probably break you. And that's usually what a lot of times happens when people who are less talented overstep their volume. So I wouldn't say that is justification that somebody shouldn't do it in general.
I don't think I was supporting the idea that they shouldn't. I also think that someone like Rich, who created his own training, inevitably in the last 2 weeks leading into a competition, he knows how to adjust his training in a way to make his body feel better.
Yeah,
and of course he was going to do that. He wasn't going to go through training in a way that made it so he showed up on game day with his body feeling like shit.
Yeah.
So even though he said he didn't taper, and that's what I was saying, like there's this underlying current that like, oh, tapering's bad, but he was writing his own training. He was definitely making himself feel better as he went, which is part of the process of tapering.
I do think it's very complicated for athletes, because if you're doing a 3-day competition and there are 10 workouts, let's say each workout has 2 or 3 movements, you're talking about 20 to 30 movements that you feel like you need to touch before the competition. And the Masters Games is a perfect example of this. The workouts came out, like 3 days before the competition?
It was not far.
So you're trying to get practice on all of those in a 3-day period, but you also don't want to beat yourself up before the competition, but you want to make sure that you're touching all those movements. So how do you do it in that kind of realm where every competition has 30 movements and you only get them a couple days ahead of time?
I mean, that's a challenge. What I did is I did partial tests of all of the workouts once they were released. But I also know that there were people, in my division, I think Julian is another one that did full tests, I think, of every single workout. That, again, to Max's point with tapers being very individualized, I think every person just needs to make a decision about what they're going to be comfortable with going into the competition and sticking to it. I could have easily gotten through 2 partial tests and been like, Adam, we have to test all of them, like in full. But I don't think that my body would have been in a place that I could have performed well on game day. But that's not the case for everybody. Some people handle that and then go into the competition and handle it without a problem.
Would you even try to convince somebody, like he said, talk me into, or talk this group into tapering? if somebody wasn't trying to be an athlete and they just wanted to do a competition, would you even talk them into trying to taper?
It depends on how long I've coached them, I think. So if they're an individual client of mine.
No, let's say it's somebody not even following our own program watching this, just like a person.
Let me start here. So if it were my own individual client, I would let them make that decision going into this. And then when it didn't work, which would be my assumption, I would have a conversation with them about that afterward. And then we would talk about the importance of tapering and peaking, and then we would go into it the next time.
I love that approach, letting them walk into their own mistakes so that they can feel it, and then now they have buy-in when you talk to them rather than preaching.
That's 15 years of coaching CrossFit experience.
Yeah. I always ask people to do like an A/B test. It's like, okay, this competition, you do what you want. And then the next one, let's taper and let's just see how you feel. And some people may like doing, Travis does like going pretty hard compared to most people. And not that
it's still taper.
It's still taper because, you're being thoughtful about how you do it, but it's more than someone else. Yeah. So it just is going to fluctuate based on the athlete, how long they've been in the sport, how good they are at the skills. Going back to the Masters Games example, 30 muscle ups for a lot of people was very daunting. So they spent more time practicing muscle up technique than they would in a normal week. That's not a taper for muscle ups, but maybe they lowered volume elsewhere. So it is going to be individualized in that regard.
That's not a taper, but it is a peak, right? So I think that's another thing to keep in mind is that the concept of tapering came from endurance sport, right? Where you would have people who are going through these really high volume cycles into really intense cycles. And then you needed a way to take them from being very tired, lower their training volume, keep intensity as high as you possibly can around race pace, and then have them peak on game day. But we're in a sport where there's an endurance component, but there's also a big skill component and also a strength component. And
strength sports had a pretty big taper structure too. I mean, all of them have a pretty big reduction in we're lifting 70% the week before. Like they're usually doing their peak loading 2 weeks out, and then everything else following that usually is lesser in weight.
Yeah, and then we also have skill sport like gymnastics, where what they're doing leading into a competition, they're not doing full routines, they're just doing the discrete skills, like the individual skills of each of the things that they're practicing or they're going to compete in. And I think that's peaking for the skill components, muscle ups, legless rope climbs, handstand walks, where you're doing dense and very intensive skill work. That doesn't mean intense, but very intensive
efficiency work at that point.
Yes, on the skills. You're running basically like a strength taper and you're running an endurance taper. And each one of those in the end needs to be individualized for the person.
All right. So if I'm listening to this podcast, I'm like, cool, you got me all bought and sold in on this idea, but I'm still no clue how I'm going to do this for myself. You want to lay out some general guidelines on if you're a person just following whatever program, how now I got this competition come December, what am I doing? What are the things I should be thinking about right now?
The best thing is if the competition releases the workouts in advance. So say they release them 2 weeks before the competition, your taper is like handed to you on a silver platter, because your job at that point is just to, number one, test the workouts to create your strategy, figure out what your weak points were in each of those workouts, and do skill work for all of those weak points. And then any workouts that you need to retest either a part of, intervals of, or something like that, you now know, okay, I need to retest this 21-15-9 thruster, bar muscle up workout because I didn't break early enough, and I need to test my breaking
Is all this at the expense of the training I had planned on doing?
I would, and this is just my take. If you're looking to peak for an off-season competition, that last 2 weeks, there's no other training that really matters if you're serious about the competition that you're going to do. All of your training should just revolve around peaking for that competition. But if you're going into the competition like we talked about earlier, like it's just you're planning on having fun or just going for the experience, or like Brandon, what was the
benchmark?
Yeah, benchmark competition. Then, maybe test one or two of the workouts, do a couple intervals of the others, and just stack that on top of your normal training. But if you're trying to peak, then once the workouts are released, that's the only thing that you're focused on.
Yeah, there might be like little things that I keep in there. If let's say there were a bunch of workouts that had grip endurance in them and I was running a progression with somebody on farmers carries and hangs, I might keep that in, but it's probably 90-10 or 90% the workouts and 10% just filling in either progressions or low intensity work.
And to your point, if there was no running, I would still keep a couple of doses of running in just because I know what it does for me personally.
Yeah.
And I have other athletes. I think Ellie Hiller comes to mind, that she would still have, her back squat and her front squat cycle that she's going to be on for,
all right,
because she has long-term strength goals.
Right. That's going to be
if we pulled back even more, I think that most people need to start their preparation plan, if we want to call it the start of a peak, 6 to 12 weeks before, kind of depending on what their training looks like. Let's say someone's in Compete, which is our online program. They're already doing CrossFit and doing strength progressions and skill progressions. So they could start that probably 6 to 8 weeks before, somewhere in there, depending on what the competition looks like. And at that point, even though you don't have the workouts, what I suggest is someone go and either look at the workouts from previous years. That's what we do as coaches. Like when we went to Masters Games, I pulled up every year of Legends programming. I pulled up all the stuff that I could find online from podcasts, and I just got a feel for what will they program? What are the biases going to be? And then I came up with a game plan from there. But at that, let's say 8-week mark, you're starting to turn or change your training to look more like the sport or what you think is going to be tested. So there's much more CrossFit sport-specific work. If you know there's going to be a lot of running, maybe you start implementing more running in your week. If there's more biking and skiing, you're doing that. If it's a lot of strength tests, you're doing that. And then
so
you run.
If that person's on our program in the example, like you just said, does that mean they're now altering our program to start doing this stuff you're mentioning?
So the great thing about our program is we have skill peaking programs that they can follow. We call it skill just because it's a fixed length program, but essentially those are 7-week long programs where you would start 7 weeks before your competition, and it will take you all the way through with all the commonly tested things that are in either qualifiers or in an in-person competition. And we have different options for that. So like the elite level athlete versus the RX athlete versus the intermediate athlete.
Yeah. Like in a normal training cycle, they'll be like, okay, these are going to be the key strength things we're working on in this cycle. These are the key movement things we're working on in this cycle. And those things over the long term, they make you way better. If you put 50 pounds on your back squat, it's probably going to help your snatch and your wall balls and your max effort rowing. But in an 8-week time frame, it might be more important for you if you're getting ready for a CrossFit competition to do more 21-15-9 thruster burpee, 150 wall balls into 300 double unders, and testing the sport as you're going to be playing it, as opposed to be training for your sport. And I think that's, maybe we didn't specifically allude to that, but I think it's moving kind of from training into more testing. Now, that gets a little bit different if people don't believe that there's a difference between training and competing. Because I know we might be more unique in that there's some people that are like, well, no, it's CrossFit all the time. Like that's all you ever do is couplets, triplets, AMRAPs. And in that case, you're only changing the dial of volume and intensity. But if you're following our program, there might be tempo split squats in there and things like that then get turned in a peaking cycle into lunges for time or, more specific sport practice.
I think the basic premise there that we ascribe to is that in the off season, your goal is to improve your ceiling. You know, that's really what you're trying to do in the off season. You're trying to improve like your endurance ceiling, or
you're making
strength.
the cup bigger to put more water in it.
Yeah, that's a great way.
This guy's metaphors. I love them.
Great.
All right. So the things I got so far is that from this whole thing is that, okay, I need to pick my competition well in advance if this is going to even happen. The second was if the workouts come out, now I switch
That's
my
your whole
training
focus.
to that.
The one caveat,
mostly.
The one caveat to that is sometimes they release them like 5 weeks in advance, and you will be bored to death
if you're just doing those
workouts.
Yeah.
And so in that case, what I tell people to do is spend, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe Thursday training. So following the Compete program or whatever program they're normally following, and then use Friday, Saturday as workout testing, almost like a competition simulation. And then the next week kind of repeat that same thing. Then the next week do a deload. Then the next week repeat that same thing and then go compete. And then at least you haven't done the same workouts every day of the week for 5 weeks in a row.
Yeah, and then you kind of ruin your off season.
Yeah.
If you're like, oh, I had the workouts for 8 weeks and that's all you did, then you didn't do all the other skills in the sport that you probably needed to get better in.
Yeah, training for a test only is guaranteed to improve your performance in that specific test. And we have seen this before, where if you create these benchmarks or artificial benchmarks, or you really struggled with open 20.2 and you spend a whole year getting better at 20.2, thinking that you're getting better at CrossFit, the reality is you got better at 20.2, and then workouts that were like somewhat related to that, and then everything else probably deteriorated. So that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Well, that's the difference in training and testing, right? If you're always testing, then you can get better at the test. But if you're training, you're getting better at all the qualities that are in the test.
That was a great way to put it. I like that a lot more than your cup analogy.
So the other nugget I got was that if you're 6 to 8 weeks out from Brandon, he said maybe one thing you could do is go dig into the past programming and start trying to make some educated guesses on what might happen and incorporate it there. Those I would say are the big three like takeaways I got. Everything else is kind of like leaving me feeling like, oh, I should probably just hire a one-on-one coach because I have no clue what to do yet. Is there anything you could say to make me feel more comfortable about knowing what the hell to do?
Yes. There's one thing you could hire a one-on-one coach. That would be very beneficial for you.
And I mean, in the programs too, Brandon answers questions and talks to people and Mike and me about what they could do to prepare and peak for something specific. But I think that is honest. It's a shitty answer, but it is the best. If somebody has experience preparing people for competitions for 15 years, they'll probably help you get ready for a competition. If not, and it's your first go around,
fire them.
yeah, fire them. But if you basically just need to like take some of these principles and only use the actionable ones, like, you know, a reduction in volume, a practicing of what you expect to be in that competition, and like the week before going like extra low volume with a couple really intense things so that you're as little fatigued as possible. And I think if you start with those like 3 fundamentals, that's probably good enough to get you started to build your process.
There was another invisible nugget there, which was you got to learn to pay attention through your practice. To Brandon's point, you pick a competition and then you actually have to pay attention to how you felt so that next time you remember and you don't just do it again. How about this? Let's say that the workouts came out 2 weeks ahead of time. What are the big mistakes people make when trying to execute that on their own? So it's in their own hands, and you know, maybe what do they get rid of from their training? Or what do they do? How do they execute wrong when they get the workouts in advance? What are the big mistakes you see?
Well, I think one of the biggest mistakes that we see is that if let's say the competition has 6 or 7 workouts, that they test every single one of the workouts all the way through 2 weeks before, then the week before they test all of the workouts again all the way through. So they've done, you know, essentially the full competition twice already before they show up. And those people, they're not tapering. They're going to end up pretty fatigued when they show up to compete. So that's, I think over testing the workouts. And we've seen this with some of our semifinal guys that are just really neurotic about testing. No, I'm not saying that. About
now everyone's going to think, was that me?
Am I that person?
Well, don't be that person.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that's the easiest one. That's like low-hanging fruit of maybe reducing the volume a little bit or just testing portions of the workout. If you get them a couple weeks ahead of time, then sure, test all the workouts. And then, Kyle, you said this earlier, pick the things that were limitations. Like I'm thinking back, I'm just going to keep going back to Masters Games since that was most recent. You did the run deadlift, and maybe you noticed the last run was a little bit challenging. So then you and Adam would have a conversation about, okay, what can I do in the next 2 weeks, which you're not going to necessarily like raise your level of fitness, but there are things maybe that you can mitigate the cramps by.
You can get more comfortable with it.
Sure.
That, I think that's another thing that people will probably, this is a common mistake where they get the workouts and they're like, oh, I need to train to improve my burpees, or I need to quickly run a 2 week, 5K progression. You're not going to improve your fitness in 2 weeks. I think Max already talked about that a little bit, but what you can do in that 2 week window is get way more comfortable with the stimulus, with the way that it's going to feel.
Yeah.
This was a good one. More stuff like that. What else do people do wrong when they see the workouts?
I think people overemphasize what they're scared of most, whether it's a workout that is going to hurt the most, that they want to touch more so they're not as scared of it, or that they're not good at. So it's like, okay, I wasn't good at muscle ups. I tested the workout in full on Monday. On Wednesday, I did 30 for time. On Friday, I tested it again. And then people end up with overuse injuries like leading into competition. And the thing that comes to my mind is the workout that had, or the year that the regionals had the ring dips and the muscle ups in them. So many people, Noah being one of them, strained themselves in their pecs before the competition even happened.
Was that pec tear year?
Yeah,
that was the workout
year. Yes.
I mean, because people were doing 100 ring dips and 50 to 75 muscle ups the week before.
And they ramped from zero because it wasn't part of the normal testing structure of movements. People weren't doing, I mean, I know like JT was a workout, but it had never showed up in the open. It never showed up in regionals, never showed up in the games. And then all of a sudden people are going from 0 to 1,000. Anytime you try to cram fitness, it's usually not good.
Well, and that goes against all the principles we just talked about for a taper, right? So a taper is built on you having the preparatory volume before you start your taper or your peak in order to reduce that volume during competition. And these guys did maybe, so if you count the dip out of a muscle up, they were maybe doing 60 to 75 total dips per week prior to those workouts being released. And then they were released, a week and a half before the competition. So in that, 10-day window, they probably, between the full test of the ring muscle up workout and the ring dip workout, they probably did 200 plus ring dips.
And it was also 5 weeks for the last regional week, because you got the 2 weeks that it didn't do. And then week 1, week 2, and week 3 was 5 weeks after release.
So what I would have done with that group would have been some preparatory volume for 3 weeks and then a 2-week taper and tested the workouts 2 weeks out. And I think I probably didn't do that that year. I'm sure I didn't, but that would have been a much better approach.
Hold on, this is good. Let's make it applicable to the example of the work. Let's say the workouts that you're getting for your November comp is 2 weeks out, and you see something on that list that you're kind of terrified of. You said what not to do. What should they do? How should they feel about that?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, I think a full run through is a good idea.
I said terrified, but what I should have said is something that you're not prepared for.
Yeah. So, I mean, a full run through to get an idea of where your capacity is. And then I think from there, the taper almost needs to be built with some focus on what was your volume prior to these workouts being released. So if you were doing like 20 muscle ups a week, and then all of a sudden this workout comes up with 30 muscle ups, trying to ramp your volume up 50% immediately while you're tapering for 2 weeks, probably not a good idea. But getting extra skill work on that movement and lower intensity versions and passive hangs and isometric support holds and doing some skill work around that is probably a good idea, because it will create some sort of an impact. But also
sell people on that real quick, more than you're doing now, because I think a lot of people hear skill work and they just don't want to do it anyway. But sell them on how that really can make a difference.
Can one of you help me? I mean, I feel like skill work is what makes you better, I think. So I feel like that's my sales pitch.
But you got to put yourself in their shoes. They're gearing up. They got this big competition and they want to get all fired up and they're doing all this stuff. And they got these other workouts that they can go express themselves to the way they want to. And we're over here saying, no, go be boring in the corner, do skill work. Come on, sell these fools.
I mean, we always talk about this in podcasts, and when we do stuff for Compete, we say that movement economy is king in the sport. Using less effort per rep makes you automatically better than someone that's the same fitness level as you, because you're not expending the same amount of energy as that person. So practicing better technique on your muscle ups or your handstand push-ups or your handstand walk just means you're now able to use less effort per rep, which will allow you to hopefully go a little bit faster in the workout. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. In skill work, I mean, attaining a clean muscle up or handstand walks take months or years for some people. But even if it's one little cue, I can get better in my arch swing or get better with where my hips are at the top of the turnover. That's going to help you get another 2 or 3 reps in a workout, which, Max, you talked about this earlier, but 3 reps could be 5 or 6 spots in an in-person competition.
Well, and to Brandon's point, the only tool that you have that can take you from, let's say you can do 1 ring muscle up. The only tool that exists to get you from 1 to multiples in like a session would be skill work. That's the only way that you could go from lacking capacity to having capacity, is to improve your movement efficiency. You're not going to build strength in one session. You're not going to build endurance in one session. But if you already have the required strength and grip endurance and all the components that are required to do 5 muscle ups, you just can't do it because your technique is crappy, then in one single training session with good skill work and good cues, you might be able to go from 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. And that is the only tool that will do that for you.
It is one of the...
We've seen it in action here.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, like, it is one of the, like, key variables that makes a good elite CrossFitter good, is how fast they can get something new. Like, this year at the games, they had that Chad thing that came up, and it was... the Chad workout, but it wasn't really Chad. It was a box and then another layer of boxes and then a box. So they had to step up, and then go over and down and down. And they created this standard where there was a line in the middle of the box. And so when you got onto the top box, your foot had to touch, both feet had to touch on this side of the line and that side of the line before you go over, which is a very unnatural way for anyone to do a step up and over like that. Like it wouldn't be the natural thing, but it's, hey, this is the movement standard. Immediately, all of the games athletes, or at least the ones that didn't have practice with it, because apparently it was something that was leaked, went over and literally practiced their footwork and practiced the skill of doing it and tried different things. And over time, by the time they all got out on the floor, they all had it pretty refined, really, from like 30 or 45 minutes of practice. Now, an elite athlete can do that in like a single session. Like they get a thing and it's like, make it efficient. Here's a sledgehammer, here's the rules. And like, they'll figure out how to game it and come up with new strategies of doing it efficiently. If you're less talented or less practiced doing things, you can still make that marginal progress, but the skill work is the like most immediate bang for your buck thing. It doesn't require weeks of progressions to get better.
To your point also, it's the thing that elite athletes do that everybody else tends to skip because it's not fun and sexy and hard and intense. But elite athletes, I remember watching Alexis weeks before the games in here doing these low ring muscle up drills for forever. And I was like, man, she spends 10 times more time on skill work than I do, and explains a lot about it.
She spends 10 times more skill work on things that she's 10 times better than other people.
She's already way better than I am.
Yes. I think of it too as like, I mean, maybe I'm different because I don't really love to suffer like in a CrossFit setting. I'll do it, but I'll do it for what I get out of it as opposed to like actually enjoying that suffering. But skill work, I feel like, is one of the things that you can do that you leave your session feeling better than you started.
Therein lies the problem, is that people finish the session feeling good. They finish feeling better versus feeling like they're completely beat down. And at no point, this is probably not entirely true, but at no point does someone go through a workout and be like, man, I was so skill limited. No, every time they're like, it was my heart rate, it was my grip, it was my, my legs, it was my,
even though half the time breathing. It's a skill.
Yes. But if their skill was, to Brandon's point earlier, if their skill was just this much more efficient, then they wouldn't have felt those limiters at the point that they did. They still would have felt them eventually, but at that point.
So I would make this bet. I know there's no way to actually do it, but the standard came out at the Masters CrossFit Games, and there were a ton of people that like get on the rings, and from my perspective, they can't even like finish the lockout reps, or they go into their kip swing and their shoulders are so tight that they can't really get extension to be able to use elastic energy to go up. I would think that if you could take that group of Masters athletes and you gave them for a 6-month period of time, we say, hey, we're going to do arch swings and hollow swings, support holds at the top of dip, support hold at the bottom, isometric holds to get you stronger in each one of the sub positions of the movement.
As opposed to adding more volume.
As opposed to just putting more muscle ups inside of workouts that you do at a low skill level. I would say that 90% of that field gets substantially better from the skill and strength work that would be doing that.
We have that program inside.
Yeah, we do.
It's all there.
But a lot of people will think they're too good to go back to refining the basics. I don't know why that is, but those are
not Alexis Raptis.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the discipline that's required to do that though is very challenging. Mm-hmm. And so I understand that, especially like seeing people through compete, doing our Got None programs can be, it is very hard, not physically, but mentally to stick with it for 8 or 12 weeks. But those that do, they all of a sudden they have muscle ups, and then they're doing from 1 to 4 to 7 in a workout to doing the standard. Whereas some people maybe are just adding more and more volume and still can't get much better. So it's definitely worth it, but I do understand those that are hesitant to do that because it requires a lot of work.
I think that just might separate the real pistol grippers from the other people. It's like maybe you're just I'm doing this more as a weekend warrior, having fun person, and that's okay.
Yeah, it is okay. I would still,
and we have programs for that too. Like I mean,
not everybody who does this wants to actually be like a legit competitor. They just like doing the, they just like pushing themselves.
I think it's more fun though once you get it though. Like if someone really does want to go and do a competition, even if it's for fun, you'll enjoy it more if you don't have those limitations. So spending some time on the skills will really help that.
I have a qualm with it because I feel like the philosophy of the thing is mechanics first, like mechanics, and then build consistency and reps and then get intense. And I feel like there's a lot of people that don't really do the movements in a way that's safe for them. So they'll like, they're weekend warriors, but they're going to like maybe hurt themselves in the process of doing it. So I'd still argue to push, or I'd like try to sell them on doing it, which I know
for sure.
I haven't been successful in 10 years other than the people that have like listened to me in that process of swaying the masses to do a basic boring movement shit.
I think it's like Kyle's thing earlier, though. You let them walk into that brick wall, and then the ones who really care are going to end up coming back and then learning.
Yeah. True.
Hey, let's end it on this. Kyle, you brought up the idea of a stinger. Or y'all talked about that earlier. Let's leave them with, okay, they did their peak, they tapered, and how should they think about those last 2 days before their competition? What are they doing? What's the stinger?
Let's give our favorite stingers.
Okay, well, first off, usually the day before is a registration day, so they're not doing much of anything. If they can even get into the gym, just a little, like 20 minutes on the bike is probably good. Get a little sweat. 2 days before, that's when you're going to hit your stinger. And my favorite stinger is either 15, 12, 9, calories row, lateral burpees over the rower, or 15, 12, 9, calories on the echo, bar facing burpees. It hurts no matter what. It stings plenty bad to get people ready to go the next day.
Yeah, I usually use something dumbbell-oriented burpees and a machine because they're usually in hotel gyms or dropping in really quick at a CrossFit gym the night before. There's usually time pressure, so something that they can get in, warm up quick, hit really hard, and get out pretty much anywhere is my favorite stinger.
Yeah, you stole mine, which is the echo bike and burpee. I like that one a little bit more. But the other one I'll do is an echo bike and a power snatch of some kind. So either it's dumbbell or just a barbell, but super light, like 55 pounds.
Mine is Sting from WCW. Well, that Sting's music. We got to go.